What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to do a video about my top 10 favorite erotic horror movies, and I've been meaning to do a lot more top 10 lists on this channel for a long time. I've done a couple videos so far, but I really enjoy doing them, and right now, obviously, we have a lot more time on our hands. I have a feeling that a lot of people out there are like me, where they're starting to get a little stir-crazy, a little cabin fever, and perhaps they could use a little high-octane cinema with which to distract themselves. And so I thought back to this post that I wrote back in the fall of 2015 on the website for my podcast, Wrong Reel. And in terms of just total clicks, it is by far the most popular thing that I ever wrote. But I figured, why not do a video version of this? Because moving forward for the next couple of years at least, I'm going to be devoting a ton of my energies into this channel. And plus, over the last couple of years, through the podcast as well as through this channel, I've seen so many just completely batshit insane movies. So I needed to reevaluate and reorganize and revise my original list. And for me, sex and horror, they've always gone together like chocolate and peanut butter. They always have, they always will. And the first time I really understood this was probably around age 10. I was just starting to take an interest in girls, and I saw Friday the 13th, Part 4, the final chapter, which featured a variety of skinny dipping scenes and casual sexual encounters that at that time about made my eyes pop right out of my head. And in the decades since, I've seen countless horror movies with nudity, as well as countless erotic movies that dip their toes into the world of horror. But the key criteria for this specific list is that in order for the film to be included, it has to work as both a horror movie as well as a turn-on. It can't be one or the other. And what I found is that that unique combination is actually surprisingly rare. I mean, obviously, when it comes to horror and erotica, what an individual finds sexy or scary is totally subjective. You kind of know it when you see it. You're either scared or you're turned on or you're not. So I won't claim that these movies are the best in this category. They're simply my favorite. And just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, I love the movie Hellraiser. It is absolutely pure dynamite as a horror movie, and is really erotic in the most extreme way imaginable. I first saw it when I was 11, and I was kind of like, oh my God, like what's going on here? But to this day, I do not find that movie to be a turn-on, so sadly, it won't make this list, even though I remain an avid fan of that movie to this day. So I fully expect and I welcome tons of alternative suggestions to the films that I'm going to include. And if people feel really passionate, they should definitely make their own list, either in written or in video form. And just to really hammer home the idea of what I'm talking about in terms of which movies make this list, there are a lot of sizzling erotic movies out there with horror ingredients that won't make the list because the horror ingredients are just kind of superficial at best. That said, you can't go wrong with movies by directors like Jean Rollin or Jesus Franco. If you're just looking for some good old-fashioned, old-school, softcore porn films about vampires, movies like Fascination or Vampiros Lesbos, I imagine as long as people are alive on this planet, they will always create and write and film and consume stories about people getting it on with vampires. It's pretty much an inexhaustible subgenre, and my list does include several examples from that category. Also, one final note, my list will not include any anime or any animation. I think I'm going to do a list about adult animation at some point, and I feel like that should just be a list unto itself. And also, if I included anime, it could have very easily overwhelmed the entire list, but I'll do my best to circle back and revisit the topic at some point. But if any of these movies grab your attention and you decide to hunt them down, I hope you'll enjoy them as much as I have. But without further delay, let's dive into my number 10, Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. I first saw this movie when I was 16. I had no idea who Francis Ford Coppola was or that he was responsible for some of the best films in the 70s, but I've always been a horror fanatic, and so when this movie came out in the theater, I was one of the first in line to check it out. I think some ingredients in this movie work really well, while others do not. I mean, Keanu Reeves doing an English accent as Jonathan Harker is particularly brutal, but no one can deny the overt sexuality on prominent display throughout much of the movie. Seeing the character Lucy Westenra kissing Mina Harker in the rain is one of the biggest turn-ons I've ever had, and the movie only cranks up the volume from there. The biggest highlight of the movie has to be seeing a young Monica Bellucci as she and her fellow vampire predators first seduce and then begin to feed upon an unsuspecting Jonathan Harker. At age 16, I didn't know whether I should be afraid or aroused or both, and that's exactly why this movie is on this list. And next up, we have Robin Hardy's 1973 film, The Wicker Man. This is not to be confused with the remake starring Nicolas Cage. This is the original Wicker Man, and I have to be careful about how I discuss it because this is one of those rare movies where I absolutely have to say, avoid spoilers at all costs. go into this movie fresh. All you need to know is that it's one of the most enjoyable cult classics ever to come out of Britain. The story is all about this cop who flies through this remote Scottish island looking for a missing girl, but what he finds is this pagan community led by horror icon Christopher Lee. And while the movie really only has one really erotic scene and one really intense horror scene, I can promise they are both used for maximum emotional impact, resulting in a movie that you will never forget. But number 8, Life Force from 1985, directed by the great Tobe Hooper. If you're unfamiliar with Cannon Films, you absolutely owe it to yourself to watch this documentary, Electric Boogaloo, The Wild Untold Story of Cannon Films. They were these professional schlockmeisters, but very successful at it, and they produced an extraordinary amount of low-budget exploitation films in every conceivable genre. And Tobe Hooper's movie Life Force is easily one of the most outrageous movies. It's a movie that's got aliens and vampires and zombies and the end of the world, and it stirs them all together into a movie that's kind of terrible in a lot of ways. However, it has the feature attraction of the astonishingly beautiful Matilda May, who spends the majority of the movie completely buck-ass nude as this predatory space vampire who sucks the life force out of anyone she encounters. But this is a true cinematic oddity of the 1980s, and it's absolutely worth hunting down. And for my 7th pick, I've got Nicholas Roeg's 1973 film Don't Look Now. Now, this is arguably the best film of Nicholas Roeg's career, but it's about so much more than mere kinky thrills. At its core, it's this beautiful but mysterious and enigmatic tale about a married couple played by Julie Christie and Donald Sutherland who are struggling to get over this horrific, just absolutely traumatizing death of their daughter, which we see early on in the movie. And this is another movie like The Wicker Man, where it's absolutely vital that you don't look it up ahead of time because you don't want to risk spoiling the ending. The first time I saw the movie, my heart just leaped into my throat. But if you're wondering why this film made the list, about 30 minutes into it, Don't Look Now features this no-holds-barred sex scene between genuine superstar at the time, Julie Christie, and Donald Sutherland, and it might be the most sizzling and erotic depiction of married sex ever caught on film. But while we're on the subject of married couples, my number 6 is easily the most disturbing and graphic film on this list. Antichrist, written and directed by arguably the most provocative director in the world, Lars von Trier. And given how powerful this movie is, I probably should rank it much higher on my list. However, it's so rough and so uncomfortable and so brutal to watch, I almost never revisit it. But the movie starts with this stunningly beautiful black and white sex scene, all to the tune of this exquisitely beautiful classical music. And then stirred into the mix, you have this unbelievably bleak and horrible personal tragedy that they experience. And the movie just escalates from there into one of the most nightmarish movie-going experiences ever created by a human being. The stars Willem Dafoe and Charlotte Gainsbourg, they're just so game, and they just meet every creative risk head on, including some really brutal violence to the genitalia of their characters. In any event, if you like provocative cinema, if you like groundbreaking, risk-taking cinema, I strongly recommend it. And along those lines, for my number 5, we've got Videodrome from 1983, directed by David Cronenberg. Now, a big switch from my written list to my video list is swapping out David Cronenberg's Shivers for Videodrome. Now, I still love and adore Shivers, and I strongly recommend everybody check out my top 10 David Cronenberg video. But while Shivers might have more nudity and this crazy orgy of sex-crazed fiends infected with these invasive parasites, Videodrome, on the other hand, might be Cronenberg's most personal film, and it has this unmistakable power to change the way we look at both sex and media, as well as our physical relationship with the technology that delivers that media to us. Debbie Harry and James Woods, they were just perfectly cast. And without going into too much detail about my own experiences, I'll simply say their characters and their exploration of the dark side of sexuality encouraged me to reevaluate some of my own hangups when I first saw the movie. But this is a genuine cult classic that absolutely deserves every bit of praise that's been heaped upon it. And we're going to stick with the 80s for my number 4, where I have The Hunger, directed by Tony Scott from 1983. Before becoming a household name directing movies like Top Gun and True Romance, Tony Scott directed this exquisite vampire love story, The Hunger. And it's one of those movies that has this crazy operatic power, which crescendos beautifully in this love scene between Susan Sarandon and Catherine Deneuve, all to the music of the Flower Duet. But while The Hunger might not always be narratively coherent, the movie starts with a bang, with both Deneuve and David Bowie out on the prowl, out on the town, seducing and then feeding upon the people they encounter, and one of the most stylish, evocative sequences of Tony Scott's career. This is one of those movies that absolutely belongs on the Mount Rushmore of erotic horror films. So it's not often that one of the biggest movie stars in the world and a full-blown Avenger decides to roll the dice like this, but the 2013 film Under the Skin, directed by Jonathan Glazer, is one of the most disturbingly erotic films ever made. ScarJo took a huge risk starring in this film, and in my opinion, the gamble 100% paid off with one of the most groundbreaking movies that I've seen in years. It depresses me that Jonathan Glazer makes movies so infrequently, but the story, such as it is, follows an alien life form exploring Scotland, and she periodically seduces men before submerging them in this terrifying vat of black liquid that appears to kind of absorb their life slowly until only a withered husk remains. And the great Scarlett Johansson, she appears in her birthday suit repeatedly throughout the film, but you'll likely be too unnerved and freaked out by the story to fully appreciate those scenes until after the fact. As far as the horror in this film is concerned, all I'll say is that there's one scene involving a baby crying alone on the beach that has left me emotionally scarred permanently. But moving on to a much more enjoyable movie, we got my number 2, Cat People, directed by Paul Schrader back in 1982. This is a remake of the classic Cat People from 1942 from director Jacques Tourneur, but Paul Schrader's 1982 remake takes the classic tale of a young woman fearing her own emergent sexuality and gives us a modern version that is totally unhindered and free of the repressive censorship of the 1940s. The movie stars Nastasia Kinski as an innocent young virgin who, unbeknownst to her, is from a supernatural bloodline that'll cause her to transform into a giant black leopard if she ever has sex with anybody who's not a fellow shapeshifter like herself. And once someone of her race has transformed, the only way her breed can revert back to human is by then committing a murder. It's funny, while talking about this movie, I'm thinking about that new show Tiger King on Netflix, and I can only imagine how excited Joe Exotic would be if he encountered some of these people. In any event, Cat People is one of the most overtly stylish films of Schrader's career, with his extraordinary score by Giorgio Moroder. He also did Scarface and American Gigolo. But the movie just oozes sex appeal from start to finish, with several scenes worth mentioning, including the lovely Annette O'Toole going skinny dipping. And Paul Schrader, he's directed many fine films over the years, such as Blue Collar, Hardcore, and American Gigolo. But in my opinion, Cat People absolutely deserves a mention in the same breath along all those other movies. So finally, we come to my number 1 favorite erotic horror movie that I've ever seen. And there are so many movies that could have just as easily made this top 10 list, but I feel like a top 10 list really only has like some excitement or some tension if you have to make some hard choices. But this is a movie that a lot of people probably have not heard of, but it's called Vampires. Vampires with a Y, from 1974, and the director's name is Jose Ramon Larraz, otherwise known as Joseph Larraz. And the story of this movie, it's so simple, but so incredibly effective. You have 2 beautiful vampires living in this isolated Gothic mansion in England, and they survive by seducing anyone they encounter on this nearby highway. And the way they take out their victims, it's not that bad. They take their prey home for an evening of lovemaking and conversation and drinking wine, and then eventually at the end of the night, they completely drain them of their blood. But the movie is just intoxicatingly sexy. But on the other hand, the movie can also be incredibly brutal and incredibly savage with some of the death scenes. But given that a lot of these victims have just experienced the menage a trois of their lifetime, you kind of don't feel so bad for them. That said, there are some moments in the movie where the violence is so extreme and has the effect of a bucket of ice cold water being poured right in your lap. And while the sex scenes are definitely the movie's feature attraction, the horror in this movie should not be underestimated. Now, I'll admit that some parts of this movie can be a little slow and tedious, but on the whole, you won't be able to take your eyes off of it. So after a bit of soul searching, I finally decided that Vampires very much deserves its place as the best erotic horror film that I've ever seen. But that's all I've got for now. I'm definitely feeling the itch to do a lot more unusual top 10 lists. On one hand, I do want to start doing things like top 10 Brian De Palma films or top 10 Michael Mann films and things like that. But I feel like those can get a little, I guess, formulaic or predictable, kind of boring to do after a while. But I feel like a way of kind of adding some variety is coming up with unusual topics like erotic horror movies. So if you want to see me do any more top 10 lists, definitely feel free to send some suggestions my way in the comments below, or you can always find me on Twitter at Colbrax, where I'm talking day and night with a hell of a lot of other film freaks on that platform. But I hope you enjoyed this video. Please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell, and if you really enjoyed it, please consider sharing the video on social media, because that's the best way for this channel to find new viewers, etc. But can't thank you enough for watching. I really appreciate it, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.